If true, those are the important words of the night. If true. That's the phrase that we always use when discussing stories that aren't yet proven to be true. And that's the language that I used here repeatedly last night at this hour when BuzzFeed reported that Michael Cohen has told Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller that President Trump ordered him to lie under oath to Congress. Is Michael Cohen, if this is proven true, guilty of lying to Congress as a crime? Is he guilty of perjury as a crime? Is the President of the United States guilty of suborning perjury if this report is true?
Yes, yes, and yes.
And now, 24 hours later, the breaking news of the night is that the Special Prosecutor's Office is disputing BuzzFeed's reporting, but we don't know exactly what the Special Prosecutor's Office is disputing within that reporting. Robert Mueller's spokesperson issued a written statement saying BuzzFeed's description of specific statements to the Special Counsel's Office and characterization of documents and testimony obtained by this office regarding Michael Cohen's congressional testimony are not accurate. BuzzFeed issued a statement standing by its reporting and then issued a second statement asking the Special Prosecutor to specify what is not accurate in their reporting. BuzzFeed's report last night was attributed to two unnamed, quote, federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of this matter, end quote. Now, that certainly sounds like a description of two people working on Robert Mueller's team. That would be one way to describe people working on Robert Mueller's team. Two federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of this matter. Identifying the sources that way might have been part of why the Special Counsel's Office took the rare step of commenting on reporting like this. Normally, the Special Counsel's Office doesn't say a word about investigative reporting like this. Tonight's statement by the Special Counsel's Office might be Robert Mueller's way of saying those two federal law enforcement officials don't work for me. They're not on my Mueller team. The Special Counsel's statement disputes the, quote, characterization of documents and testimony obtained by this office regarding Michael Cohen's congressional testimony, end quote. Now, that seems to take direct issue with this paragraph of last night's BuzzFeed report. The Special Counsel's Office learned about Trump's directive for Cohen to lie to Congress through interviews with multiple witnesses from the Trump Organization and internal company emails, text messages, and a cache of other documents. Cohen then acknowledged those instructions during his interviews with that office. The timing and content of the BuzzFeed story last night put more pressure on the Special Counsel's Office than possibly any other news report that has come before it. Senator Chris Murphy said, listen, if Mueller does have multiple sources confirming Trump directed Cohen to lie to Congress, then we need to know this ASAP. Mueller shouldn't end his inquiry, but it's about time for him to show Congress his cards before it's too late for us to act. Now, Senator Chris Murphy is a patient person, but even his patience with Robert Mueller's investigation was tested by last night's BuzzFeed report that, if true, would have meant the President of the United States was clearly guilty of impeachable offenses. And it could be that one of the reasons Robert Mueller decided to respond to this story is because impeachment is now a real possibility for the president, and it wasn't last year. Because last year, the evidence like this could come forward, and because Paul Ryan and the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, impeachment wasn't possible. And Robert Mueller could be certain last year that House Republicans were not going to get out ahead of his investigation and start impeachment proceedings. Now, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats control the House of Representatives, and now impeachment in the House is a real possibility. And that might be why Robert Mueller decided to pump the brakes on this story after watching 24 full hours of momentum for impeachment building, specifically because of this story. Leading off our discussion now on this Friday night, Joy Reid, MSNBC national correspondent and the host of AM Joy Weekends on MSNBC, Ken Dilanian, intelligence and national security reporter for NBC News, and Mimi Rocah, former federal prosecutor and an MSNBC legal contributor. And Ken Dilanian, I know you've been doing some of your own original reporting on this story, on what might or might not be being disputed by Robert Mueller's office. What can we make of that at this stage?
Well, Lawrence, it's more of an analysis. My take on the statement, which is very specific, is that they are disputing the part of the story that asserts that the special counsel gathered texts, emails, and interviews with members of the Trump organization that corroborated Michael Cohen's statement that Trump told him to lie. In fact, the sequence was Mueller got that first and then went to Cohen, and Cohen acknowledged that, yes, Trump told him to lie. That appears to be what Mueller is specifically disputing. He is not commenting and certainly not disputing the notion that Michael Cohen's story is that Trump told him to lie. And in fact, there's a paragraph buried in a sentencing memorandum that was filed by Cohen's lawyers in November that specifically says he lied to Congress at the direction of Client One, which is Donald Trump. Now, there are other parts of what Michael Cohen said in court that day where he discussed why he lied to Congress, where he doesn't say it was at the direction of Donald Trump. But it's possible that, he was under instructions not to say that at that time. We just don't know. But what we do know is that Robert Mueller is not disputing the entirety of the BuzzFeed story. He is, however, disputing this notion that his office has reams of corroborating information. And in fairness, that is one of the things that got everybody's attention about this story because, the House of Representatives is not going to impeach Donald Trump on the word of Michael Cohen, admitted liar. But if there's other corroboration from members of the Trump organization, that's a different matter. And it appears that there isn't, at least the way BuzzFeed described it.
I want to read a tweet tonight from investigative reporter Ronan Farrow, who has been apparently working in this same territory. He said, "I can't speak to BuzzFeed's sourcing, but for what it's worth, I declined to run with parts of the narrative they conveyed based on a source central to the story, repeatedly disputing the idea that Trump directly issued orders of that kind. Note that the general thrust of Cohen lying to Congress in accordance with or to support and advance Trump's agenda per Cohen's legal memo is not in dispute. The source disputed the further, more specific idea that Trump issued and memorialized repeated direct instructions." And Joy Reid, that part about memorialized would be, I think, a reference in the BuzzFeed article to there is supporting documentation, right, either from texts or emails to what BuzzFeed was reporting that the president basically ordered Michael Cohen to commit perjury.
Right, as well as one line in the BuzzFeed story where they characterize something that Cohen allegedly said to the Mueller team. Now, the Mueller team is very tight-lipped and they do not leak. And, one could assume that maybe what they're also trying to project and telegraph is, do not write a story in which you're projecting that that members of the Mueller team have leaked information to BuzzFeed, right? I mean, when Michael Cohen pleaded guilty in the Southern District of New York, he said, himself, as he stood up and spoke to the judge, that he lied specifically about this Moscow Trump Tower project. This is something that is already on the record. It's something he's already admitted to in the Southern District of New York. So I think I agree with Ken in that, I think everyone is now kind of hair on fire about the denial by the special counsel's office, but I kind of I'm reading it narrowly until we know more.
So, Mimi Rocah, we know that there are a bunch of federal officials in Michael Cohen's life. There is the special counsel's office, Robert Mueller, and then there is separately your old office, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, where he has already pleaded guilty. He has already been sentenced there. Donald Trump has been identified there, in effect, as an unindicted co-conspirator, referred to in the documents as Individual One. One of the blooming theories of the hour this evening is that these federal officials quoted in this are from the Southern District of New York as opposed to Mueller's team. Does that, when you read the BuzzFeed article, does that read as possible to you?
No. I mean, first of all, let me be clear about something. People are using this term, the Southern District of New York. That, to me, and to almost any prosecutor, defense lawyer, anyone working in the system, means the U.S. Attorney's Office, okay? Mm-hmm. I can sit here right now and tell you that there is a less than zero chance that someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York...
Okay, but it could also refer to FBI officials in the same building.
Well, they're not in the same building. The FBI is in a separate building. And look, I'm not as integrated in that culture. I can't give that same statement as I would about the Southern District of New York. There have been leaks from the FBI in the past, but this did not read to me like statements coming from someone who has been sitting in the room with Cohen. In other words, it sounds to me, and I think what we're all saying, is there is truth in this story, right? It's not as clear cut as it was a few hours ago. A few hours ago, we had a clear cut crime of Trump directing him to lie and supposed mountains of evidence external to Cohen. Now we have something more vague. We're back to the gray area, which is criminal law, frankly, which is Cohen lied. He has made statements. Mueller has made statements in his sentencing memorandum that in support of Cohen, that there were discussions between Cohen and the White House, that he circulated his testimony. It's not as clear what those discussions were, who they were with, but it doesn't exonerate Trump. It doesn't mean something didn't happen.
Right.
It's just not as clear what it was. And I think what Mueller is saying is, whoa, let's not rush to impeachment. He's putting the brakes on, as you say, and let's see. Let the facts come out the way I, Mueller, am going to describe them. And so back to your original question, it seems to me that something got lost in translation here. I don't necessarily think this is someone who made up facts, meaning whoever the sources are, or that BuzzFeed got it wrong. But things are very nuanced when you're describing things in proffer sessions and sessions with cooperators, when you're looking at 302s. I mean, they're terms of art, and it seems to me that somebody who has some familiarity got something lost in translation, and I don't think that would be the New York FBI.
Yeah. Ken Dilanian, BuzzFeed is asking for a clarification on the special prosecutor's statement tonight. Any chance of that happening?
No, I don't think so. And look, I feel for BuzzFeed. I think Robert Mueller's strategy of saying nothing about anything ever, even off the record, is very frustrating. I mean, even the Central Intelligence Agency will give reporters a steer at times if they think they're about to get something horribly wrong. And if Mueller had done that in this case, perhaps BuzzFeed would have been more cautious and could have avoided this whole matter, which is not good for journalism. It's really frustrating. It feels like Robert Mueller at this point in the investigation owes the public a little bit more information than we're getting about something so important. Lawrence, that's my feeling about it.
So Democratic House member Ted Lieu last night tweeting when this story broke. This is how hot it felt at this hour last night. Based on the BuzzFeed report and numerous other articles showing Donald Trump committed obstruction of justice and other possible felonies, it is time for the House Judiciary Committee to start holding hearings to establish a record of whether POTUS committed high crimes. And Joy Reid, that's a reality now, and that tweet would have gone to nowhere a year ago or any time last year because Republican control of the House Judiciary Committee would have meant that tweet wasn't worth wallpaper. But now that kind of momentum is what Robert Mueller was watching today and eventually deciding he had to say something.
Well, I think that in a sense, rarely saying anything and then coming out and disputing part of the story, but not definitively knocking the story down. I think the most difficult line to maintain in Washington right now is the line, we need to wait and see what Robert Mueller does before we exercise our own independent oversight authority. The House of Representatives has every right and, in a sense, a duty to allow the public to understand what's happening here. They have to respect what's going on in Robert Mueller's investigation. Of course, they don't want to ruin or, harm the investigation. But there's no logical reason why hearings couldn't be held. And under the Constitution, that is what impeachment is. It isn't throwing Donald Trump out of office. It's allowing hearings where the public can start to understand the narrative of what was done, potentially to our election, to elect Donald Trump and what he did while in office.
Yeah, and as we're going to discuss later in the show, that's the way it worked in the Nixon situation. The Congress was moving at the same speed, basically, as the special prosecutor. Mimi, some fascinating elapsed times here in this case. Yesterday, BuzzFeed reports that 5 hours went by, 5 hours of silence from the White House after they've disclosed their reporting to the White House. And they're asking for comment from the White House, and the White House does not say a word. Donald Trump knew what BuzzFeed was going to write for 5 hours. He didn't issue or offer one word of denial. And then we have the 24 hours that Robert Mueller watched this story. Now, given the size of his team, Does that elapsed time make sense to you? Because one of the first things he's going to want to do is make sure this leak did not come from my shop. That presumably would take some portion of the day to be sure of that.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think you hit the nail on the head. He could have been doing sort of their own check to make sure before they said things. And, I think the fact it is frustrating. I understand what Ken is saying. And to Joy's point of this selective putting out of a statement, it's frustrating, right? But on the other hand, I think the fact that he put this out tonight should reaffirm to the American public that Robert Mueller is trying to find the truth, right? And I think what caused him to do something different this time, after hopefully checking and doing their own internal investigation, is the political, impetus, as you were saying. And he wants what he's doing to be about fact-finding in a certain setting, not in the political setting. That, I think, actually may weigh in favor of parallel impeachment hearings beginning, because Mueller's job is not to inform us.
Right.
He does. And he does it really well. And when you look at his documents, those are things he can prove. And I think what made him nervous was exactly what, was in that tweet you read from Senator Murphy, which is, that Mueller is sitting on this mountain of evidence that he's not giving us. And I think what Mueller is saying is, no, if I had a mountain of evidence, I would be doing something about it. I might have charged someone. But he's also not saying that the allegations aren't true. And so if what the people need now, and we've gotten to that point, is we need more information than just what Mueller's job is to give us, then that's a different body.
And that is what we're going to turn to as this program goes on later tonight. Mimi Rocah, Ken Delaney, and Jerry Reed, thank you for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.